Congratulations, you've just woken up in a small English village sometime around the year 1350. The frosty air bites at your nose and cheeks as you peel your eyes open in the darkness. Good news, you've survived another night in the depths of winter. Bad news, it's now time to face the day. The first thing you notice is the bone-chilling cold that has seeped into your humble cottage overnight. Your home is nothing like modern houses with their insulated walls and sealed windows. Instead, you live in a simple one-room dwelling with walls made of wattle and daub. You know, a wooden frame filled with a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and sometimes even animal dung. The roof above is thatched with straw, which provides decent protection from rain, but does little to keep the warmth in. You're not alone in this small space. Your family, perhaps a spouse, a few children, maybe an aging parent, all sleep huddled together on a single straw mattress raised slightly off the dirt floor. The good news is that sleeping close together helps share body heat. The bad news is that your bedding consists of rough woolen blankets that itch terribly, and your mattress is home to a variety of uninvited guests, fleas, and other biting insects that thrive even in winter. In the corner of your home, a few chickens roost. You might also share your living space with a goat or pig during the harshest winter months. The animal's body heat is a welcome addition, and keeping them alive through winter is essential for your family's future. Of course, there's a downside to this arrangement. The smell and mess of livestock living indoors isn't pleasant, but it's a small price to pay for the warmth they provide. Rise and shine, you mumble to your children, though there's precious little sunshine to be seen. Outside, the world is still dark, but you can't afford to waste any daylight hours once the sun does decide to make its brief winter appearance. The most pressing morning task is rekindling the fire. If you're lucky, a few embers remained hot overnight in the central hearth. You carefully add some dry straw and gently blow until the tiny orange glow spreads. Gradually, you add small twigs and eventually larger pieces of wood. The firewood is precious. Gathering it took many hours during autumn, and it must last until spring. The smoke from your fire doesn't exit through a proper chimney. Those are luxuries for the wealthy. Instead, it fills the upper portion of your cottage before eventually finding its way out through a hole in the roof. The good news is that the smoke helps preserve the thatching above, preventing it from rotting and keeping some insects at bay. The bad news is that your eyes sting and your lungs burn from constantly breathing this smoky air as the dim winter light finally begins to filter through the single small window of your home, which has no glass but might be covered with an oiled cloth or animal skin to keep out the worst of the drafts. You can now see your breath misting in the air. Even with the fire lit, the cottage never truly gets warm during winter. At best, the area directly around the hearth becomes tolerable. Your first real task of the day is preparing breakfast. The meal would seem painfully simple to modern standards. A thin porridge made from whatever grain you have stored, perhaps barley or rye. If you're fortunate, you might add a tiny bit of honey or dried fruit. More likely, it's just boiled grain with a sprinkle of salt, if you can afford such a luxury. After ladling the hot porridge into wooden bowls for your family, you take a moment to appreciate even this simple food. Winter is the hungry season, and food stores dwindle alarmingly as the weeks pass. The good news is that you planned carefully after harvest, setting aside enough grain to hopefully last through these lean months. The bad news is that many winters bring unexpected challenges. A leaky storage bin that allowed moisture in, causing precious grain to rot, or perhaps rodents finding their way into your stores. Eat up, you tell your children. We've got work to do. Even in winter, there are endless chores for a medieval peasant. While the growing season has long passed, animals still need tending, repairs must be made, and preparations for spring can begin even in the coldest months. As you step outside, the cold intensifies. Your clothing provides some protection, but nothing like modern winter gear. You wear several layers, a linen undergarment next to your skin, then one or more woolen tunics or dresses. Your outer layer might be a cloak made of heavy wool, perhaps lined with fur if you're among the more prosperous peasants. On your feet are simple leather shoes, maybe stuffed with straw for insulation, and wrapped with rags for extra warmth. A woolen cap covers your head, and you might have mittens made from scrap fabric or leather. The good news is that wool retains some of its insulating properties even when wet. The bad news is that your clothes are perpetually damp in winter, between sweat, snow, and the general moisture in the air. Drying them completely is nearly impossible without risking scorching them by the fire. Your village looks different in winter. The muddy pathways between cottages might be frozen solid or covered in snow. Smoke rises from the homes of your neighbors, fellow peasants who face the same daily struggle for survival. In the distance stands the manor house where the lord who owns these lands lives in relative comfort. Beyond that, you can see the village church, its stone walls standing firm against the winter winds. Your first outdoor task is checking on the livestock. Most medieval peasants owned at least a few animals, perhaps chickens for eggs, a goat or cow for milk, maybe a pig or two, and possibly an ox for heavy farm work. In summer, these animals might graze in common fields, but in winter, they need fodder that you carefully stored during the autumn harvest. The good news is that caring for animals gives purpose to your winter days. The bad news is that fodder, like all stores, is finite. Each day requires careful calculation, feeding the animals enough to keep them alive without depleting your stores before spring, grass, appears. After tending to the animals, you might spend hours repairing tools that will be needed when planting season arrives. A broken plow, a damaged harrow, a splintered yoke, all must be fixed using whatever materials you've managed to salvage or trade for. This detailed work is perfect for winter days when field work is impossible. The good news about winter is that it provides time for these necessary repairs and crafts. The bad news is that your fingers grow stiff and clumsy in the cold, making precise work frustrating and sometimes dangerous as tools slip in numb hands. By midday, your stomach is already growling again. The winter diet of a medieval peasant was monotonous and often barely adequate. The midday meal might be more porridge, perhaps with the luxury of a few vegetables from your winter stores, dried peas or beans soaked and cooked into a thick pottage, or hearty root vegetables like turnips and parsnips that keep well in cold storage. Meat is a rarity, saved for special occasions. You might have slaughtered a pig at the beginning of winter, carefully preserving the meat by smoking or salting it. This precious protein is rationed throughout the season, with most days being meatless. Fish could be an option if you live near water and can break through the ice to try your luck, or if you've managed to preserve some fish from more abundant times. The good news about medieval winter food is that the cold weather helps preserve your stores longer than would be possible in warmer months. The bad news is the lack of fresh fruits and vegetables, which leads to nutritional deficiencies. By late winter, many peasants suffer from various ailments related to poor diet, including scurvy from lack of vitamin C. As afternoon wears on, you gather with family and perhaps neighbors for some of the day's most essential work, collecting firewood. While you stockpiled wood during autumn, winter always demands more than expected. You trek to the edge of the woods that belong to your lord, careful to gather only fallen branches and dead wood, as cutting living trees was strictly forbidden and could result in severe punishment. The good news about this communal wood gathering is the companionship it offers during the isolating winter months. The bad news is the physical toll of trudging through snow, breaking ice, and carrying heavy loads of wood back to the village with cold, stiffened limbs. As daylight begins to fade, all too quickly during winter months, you head back to your cottage. Evening brings the day's final meal, perhaps the most substantial. The family gathers around the fire, sharing another bowl of pottage, maybe with a precious morsel of preserved meat, or fish added to the mix if you're fortunate. Evenings in a medieval winter were long and dark. Candles and lamp oil were expensive luxuries that most peasants couldn't afford to use regularly. Instead, the fire provides both warmth and light. These hours might be spent in quiet conversation, telling stories, or working on indoor tasks like spinning wool, weaving, or carving wooden items that could be used or traded. The good news about these long winter evenings is that they foster family bonds and creativity. The bad news is the unrelenting darkness, with only the flickering firelight to combat the heavy shadows that fill your home. As bedtime approaches, you bank the fire carefully, covering hot coals with ashes to help them stay lit until morning. Losing your fire in winter could be disastrous, as starting a new one from scratch was difficult and time-consuming. You might heat a stone by the fire and wrap it in cloth to take to bed, providing at least some warmth as you settle in for the night. The family, once again, huddles together on the straw mattress, pulling the rough blankets close. Tomorrow will bring similar challenges: the cold, the hunger, the endless work of simply surviving. Yet there's comfort in routine and in knowing that each day brings you closer to spring. As you drift towards sleep, you might ponder the good and bad of your medieval winter existence. The good news is the strong sense of community that hardship creates, as villagers work together and support one another through the difficult months. The bad news is the precariousness of life, where one bad harvest, one severe storm, or one bout of illness could tip the delicate balance from survival to tragedy. But winter in medieval times wasn't only about hardship and struggle. It also brought moments of joy and celebration that helped brighten the darkest days. The medieval calendar was marked by religious festivals that provided welcome breaks from the daily grind. Christmas was a particularly important time, with 12 days of celebration from Christmas Eve to Epiphany on January 6th. Even peasants might enjoy special foods saved for this occasion, perhaps attend a more elaborate church service, and participate in community celebrations. The good news about these winter festivals was the respite they offered from work and worry, bringing light and community to the darkest days of the year. The bad news was that they were brief, and the harsh reality of winter quickly returned once the celebrations ended. Despite all the hardships, medieval peasants developed remarkable resilience and ingenuity for surviving winter. They carefully planned throughout the year, preserving foods through salting, smoking, drying, and fermenting. They developed communal support systems, sharing resources and labor when needed. They learned to predict weather patterns through careful observation, and they passed down crucial knowledge from generation to generation. The good news was that this traditional knowledge generally served them well, helping communities survive century after century in challenging conditions. The bad news was that unusual weather patterns or unexpected events could still devastate even the most prepared communities. As the winter grew longer, village food stores would dwindle dangerously. By February and March, many peasant families faced their most difficult time, stretching increasingly meager supplies while waiting anxiously for the first spring growth. This period even had a name, the Hunger Gap, when winter stores ran low but spring had not yet provided new food sources. The good news was that communities developed specific strategies for these lean times, including carefully preserved emergency supplies and knowledge of which wild plants might be foraged earliest. The bad news was that these final weeks of winter claimed the lives of the most vulnerable, the very young, the elderly, and those already weakened by illness or previous hardship. As you lie in your bed, listening to the winter wind howl outside your drafty cottage, you take comfort in small blessings, the breathing of your family around you, the faint glow of banked embers, the knowledge that you've survived another day in this harsh season. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, but also the quiet satisfaction of facing those challenges with the wisdom and strength passed down through countless generations of those who came before you. And, with that thought, you drift into sleep, another day of medieval winter survival complete. The darkness outside is absolute, the cold relentless, but within your simple home is the warmth of family and the resilience of the human spirit that has always found ways to endure even the harshest seasons. You wake with a start, the sound of coughing echoing in your small cottage. One of your children has developed that familiar winter hack, a sound that strikes dread into the heart of any medieval parent. In your time, a simple cough can be the first sign of something far more serious, and winter is when illness strikes hardest. As you place a gentle hand on your child's forehead, you feel the telltale warmth of fever. The good news is that your family has survived many winter illnesses before. The bad news is that, in medieval times, disease is poorly understood and truly effective treatments are rare. You rise quietly, careful not to disturb the others still sleeping, and move to the hearth where last night's embers still glow faintly. Breathing gently on the coals and adding small kindling, you coax the fire back to life. The first light of dawn won't appear for hours yet, but sleep has abandoned you as worry takes its place. While the fire grows, you reach for a small bundle of dried herbs hanging from one of the roof beams. Medieval peasants relied heavily on herbal remedies passed down through generations. Your grandmother taught your mother, who taught you which plants to gather during summer and autumn, how to dry and store them, and how to prepare them for various ailments. For your coughing child, you prepare a simple tea of dried thyme and sage, plants known for easing coughs and fighting fevers. You add a precious spoonful of honey, saved for just such occasions. The good news is that some of these traditional remedies did contain effective medicinal properties. The bad news is that without understanding why certain plants helped certain conditions, treatment was often hit or miss. As you prepare the herbal remedy, you whisper a prayer. In medieval times, illness was understood as much through religious and superstitious frameworks as through practical observation. Disease might be seen as divine punishment, the work of evil spirits, or the result of an imbalance in the body's humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Most peasants combined practical treatments with spiritual appeals, hedging their bets against the mysterious forces that brought sickness. Your child wakes as you approach with the warm tea, face flushed with fever. "Drink slowly," you murmur, helping to hold the simple wooden cup. "This will help you feel better." Whether your confidence is genuine or merely a comforting performance for a frightened child, it serves its purpose. The good news is that showing confidence often helps keep panic at bay. The bad news is that deep down, you know how powerless you truly are against serious illness. By now, other family members are stirring. Your spouse takes on morning chores while you tend to the sick child. This flexibility of roles was common in peasant households, While medieval society had clear gender divisions in many areas, illness and crisis often required everyone to adapt and take on whatever tasks were needed for family survival. Word of your child's illness spreads quickly through the village. In the close-knit community of a medieval hamlet, information travels fast, and sickness in one household is everyone's concern. By mid-morning, a neighbor appears at your door with a small bundle of dried elderberries, known to help with fever and colds. Another brings a portion of chicken broth from one of the few birds recently slaughtered. The good news about medieval village life is this strong sense of community, support during times of crisis. The bad news is that the same close proximity and shared resources that foster this support also allow disease to spread rapidly through the population. Your village, like most medieval communities, has developed collective strategies for dealing with winter illnesses. Certain older women are known for their healing knowledge and are often called upon when someone falls sick, though later centuries would sometimes view such women with suspicion during witch hunts. In your village, these wise women are respected for their practical knowledge of herbal remedies and traditional treatments. One such woman visits your home by midday, examining your child with weathered hands and keen eyes that have seen countless winters and the illnesses they bring. She recommends a poultice of mustard seed wrapped in cloth to be placed on the chest, which might help loosen the congestion in the lungs. She also suggests hanging fresh bundles of strongly scented herbs, like rosemary, around the sleeping area, believed to purify the air of disease-causing miasmas. The good news is that some of these traditional treatments did provide genuine relief for certain symptoms. The bad news is that without understanding germ theory, even the most well-intentioned care could sometimes spread infection rather than cure it. As the short winter day progresses, you maintain a careful vigil. Medieval peasants understood that the first day or two of illness often determined whether someone would recover quickly or face a more serious battle. The greatest fear is that a simple cough might develop into pneumonia or consumption, tuberculosis, diseases that claimed countless lives during the winter months. You ensure your child drinks plenty of fluids, herbal teas, weak ale, which was safer than water in medieval times due to the brewing process, and broth when available. You keep the fire burning to maintain warmth in the cottage, though this requires using precious winter firewood at a faster rate than planned. The good news about medieval healthcare is that basic supportive care, keeping patients warm, hydrated, and fed, was well understood and practiced. The bad news is that without antibiotics or effective ways to reduce dangerous fevers, many infections that would be considered minor today could become life-threatening. By evening, other concerns begin to press on your mind, with one family member sick and another primarily occupied with caregiving. The essential daily chores of winter survival become more challenging. Animals still need feeding, water must be fetched, and firewood gathered. In a medieval peasant household, there was precious little margin for disruption in the daily work routine. Fortunately, the same community that brought remedies also offers practical help. A neighbor's child arrives to help with livestock care, and another brings a bundle of firewood to supplement your supply. This mutual aid system was essential to village survival, with each family knowing that their turn to need help would inevitably come. Many hands make light work, your neighbor says with a nod as he drops off the firewood, a sentiment that defined medieval community life, especially during the challenging winter months. As darkness falls early, as it always does in winter, your family gathers around the fire for the evening meal. Your sick child manages to eat a small portion of the simple pottage, a thick soup of barley and dried vegetables that forms the staple of your winter diet. Even this small appetite is an encouraging sign. The good news is that your child's fever seems to be holding steady rather than worsening. The bad news is that the night ahead will be long and anxious, as darkness in the medieval world brought heightened fears and limited options for care. Nighttime illness in medieval winter presented particular challenges. Without adequate lighting, candles and lamp oil were expensive luxuries. Caring for the sick during night hours meant working largely by touch and sound in the dim glow of the banked fire. Temperature changes were harder to monitor, and deteriorating symptoms might not be noticed until morning. You prepare for the night by placing a small cup of herbal tea near the fire where it will stay warm, gathering extra blankets, and arranging sleeping positions so that you can easily reach your sick child. The family settles in earlier than usual, conserving energy for what might be a difficult night. In the darkness, the sounds of winter become more pronounced, the wind whistling through thatching, the occasional creak of wooden beams contracting in the cold, the soft breathing of your family members, and the more labored breathing of your sick child. Medieval peasants were intimately attuned to these sounds, reading in them the subtle changes that might signal improvement or decline in a patient's condition. Through the night, you wake frequently to check on your child, offering sips of tea and adjusting coverings as needed. This pattern of interrupted sleep would be familiar to any parent throughout history, but for medieval caregivers, each wakeful moment also carried the weight of knowing how quickly illness could turn deadly, especially for the young and old. As the night deepens, your thoughts turn to other winters and other illnesses your family and village have endured. The specter of the great mortality, what later generations would call the Black Death, still haunts collective memory, even years after its most devastating outbreaks. Though the plague was most associated with warmer months, winter brought its own deadly infections, particularly those affecting the lungs. The good news is that your village has been spared the worst epidemics in recent years. The bad news is that every medieval person lived with the knowledge that disease could sweep through a community with devastating speed, leaving grief and empty homes in its wake. By morning, your vigilance is rewarded with small signs of improvement. Your child's fever has broken sometime in the night, and though the cough remains, it seems less severe. The immediate crisis appears to be passing, though recovery will take time and continued care. Word of the improvement spreads through the village as quickly as news of the illness did. Your neighbors express relief, not just out of compassion, but also from practical concern. Widespread illness could threaten the entire community's winter survival if too many fell sick to perform essential tasks. God has been merciful, one neighbor comments when she visits. This religious framework for understanding both illness and recovery was central to medieval experience. While practical remedies were applied diligently, ultimate credit for healing was given to divine intervention, often mediated through the intercession of saints specifically associated with certain ailments. The improvement in your child's condition allows you to turn attention back to the ongoing demands of winter survival. The episode has depleted some of your carefully stored supplies, extra firewood burned to maintain warmth, herbs used for remedies, and food shared to make nourishing broths. These resources must now be conserved even more carefully to last until spring. This pattern of crisis, community response, and readjustment was a familiar rhythm in medieval village life. The good news is that this created remarkably resilient communities, capable of weathering difficulties through collective action. The bad news is that repeated hardships could eventually overwhelm even the most resilient systems, especially in years of poor harvests or widespread illness. As your child begins recovering, you reflect on the precarious nature of winter health in medieval times. Beyond acute illnesses like fevers and coughs, winter brought numerous other health challenges that affected daily life and long-term well-being. Skin conditions were particularly common, exacerbated by infrequent bathing during cold months when exposing the body to water seemed dangerous and impractical. The rough wool clothing worn in winter, often unwashed for months, caused irritation and rashes. Chilblains, painful inflammation of small blood vessels from exposure to cold, affected many hands and feet, making daily work even more difficult. Poor nutrition as winter progressed led to various deficiencies. By late winter, the lack of fresh fruits and vegetables often resulted in symptoms of scurvy, bleeding gums, loose teeth, and poor wound healing from vitamin C deficiency. Joint pain intensified in the cold and damp conditions, particularly for older villagers or those who had sustained injuries in previous years. The good news is that medieval people recognized many of these conditions and had developed practices to mitigate them. Certain preserved foods like sauerkraut retained some vitamin content. Wild plants that appeared early in spring, such as nettles and dandelions, were eagerly harvested for their nutritional benefits. The bad news is that without understanding the underlying causes of nutritional deficiencies, prevention was inconsistent and often inadequate. Mental health, though not conceptualized as we understand it today, was also affected by the winter months. The isolation, darkness, and hardship of winter could bring melancholy and despair, conditions recognized in medieval medical texts, if not fully understood. Modern seasonal affective disorder likely affected many medieval people, particularly in northern regions, with very short winter days. Communities developed social strategies to combat this winter isolation and depression, gathering for storytelling, music, or simple conversation by the fire provided mental stimulation and emotional support. Work that could be done indoors, like spinning, weaving, or tool repair, was often performed in small groups rather than individually, creating opportunities for social interaction during the isolated winter months. The good news about these social gatherings was the sense of community and shared experience they fostered. The bad news was that the same close indoor gatherings that provided emotional comfort also created ideal conditions for the spread of infectious disease. As your family navigates the recovery from this episode of illness, you're reminded of the knowledge passed down through generations about surviving winter ailments. Your grandparents lived through far worse winters and epidemics, and their accumulated wisdom, practical remedies, observation skills, preventative practices, has been transmitted to you through stories and direct teaching. This oral tradition of health knowledge was essential in medieval communities, where literacy was rare and written medical texts, when they existed at all, were in Latin and accessible only to educated clerics and physicians who served the wealthy. Peasant medicine relied on observation, experience, and carefully preserved traditional knowledge. Watch the chest when they breathe, your mother had taught you. When the skin pulls in between the ribs with each breath, that's when you need to worry most. Such practical diagnostic skills helped families make crucial decisions about when to intensify care, when to seek additional help, and when to prepare for the possibility of death. For despite all care and community support, death was a frequent winter visitor in medieval villages. Infant mortality was particularly high, with children under 5 being especially vulnerable to respiratory infections. The elderly, already weakened by a lifetime of physical labor and previous illnesses, often succumbed during particularly harsh winter periods. The good news, if it can be called that, was that medieval communities had developed meaningful rituals and belief systems to make sense of death and help the living cope with loss. The bad news was the frequency with which these rituals needed to be performed, especially during difficult winters. When death did come to a village household, the community responded with practical and spiritual support. Neighbors would help prepare the body. A fire would be maintained in the home during the brief period before burial, and the church bells would toll to announce the passing and call for prayers for the departed soul. Winter burials presented their own challenges, with frozen ground sometimes making grave digging nearly impossible, requiring bodies to be stored until the earth thawed enough for proper interment. But your family has been fortunate this time. The illness that struck has begun to recede, leaving exhaustion but not tragedy in its wake. As your child continues to recover, sleeping now more peacefully than during the height of the fever, you turn your attention back to the ongoing work of winter survival. Outside your cottage, the winter sun makes a brief appearance, sending weak rays through your small window opening. Even this minimal light lifts your spirits after the anxious night. Medieval people were keenly attuned to these small gifts of light and warmth during the dark months, seeing in them both practical benefit and symbolic reassurance that spring would eventually return. You step outside briefly to empty a basin of water used for compresses during the night. The cold air, fresh after the smoky interior of your cottage, fills your lungs. In the village center, you see others going about their necessary tasks, carrying water, tending livestock, repairing tools and equipment. Life continues its measured winter pace, each day bringing the community one step closer to spring. A neighbor waves in greeting, calling out to ask after your child. You respond with cautious optimism, and she nods in understanding. This exchange, brief as it is, reinforces the shared experience of winter survival, the knowledge that each household faces similar challenges, and that none faces them entirely alone. The good news is that this sense of shared struggle creates bonds that help sustain both individuals and the community through the darkest season. The bad news is that even these bonds can be tested by prolonged hardship, as scarcity sometimes forces difficult choices about the distribution of limited resources. Back inside your cottage, you find your recovering child awake and asking for food, a welcome sign. You prepare a small portion of the previous night's pottage, reheated by the fire. While simple, this food represents the careful planning and preservation that makes winter survival possible. Each stored grain, dried vegetable, and preserved meat is the result of labor performed months earlier, with winter's challenges clearly in mind. As your child eats, you begin catching up on tasks neglected during the height of the illness. There is wool to be carded and spun, a crucial indoor winter activity that provides both necessary material for clothing and potential income through trade or sale. There are repairs to be made to a leak in the roof that became apparent during recent snowmelt. There are plans to adjust now that some supplies have been used more quickly than anticipated due to the illness. Medieval peasant life required this constant adaptation and problem solving, particularly during winter when margins for error were slim. The good news is that this necessity bred remarkable resourcefulness and practical ingenuity. The bad news is the constant mental burden of navigating survival with such limited resources and technological options. Your spouse returns from morning chores with news from elsewhere in the village. Another household has someone showing signs of illness similar to what your child experienced. This information is both concerning and practically useful, suggesting a pattern rather than an isolated incident. Medieval communities tracked the spread of illness carefully, using this information to make decisions about care, approaches, and community gatherings. Best to postpone the woolworking gathering planned for tomorrow, your spouse suggests, and you agree. While such social work events were important for both productivity and morale during winter, the risk of spreading sickness outweighed the benefits when illness was moving through the village. As the day continues, you maintain a watchful eye on your recovering child while returning to the rhythm of necessary work. The illness has been a reminder of winter's dangers, but also of the systems of knowledge, practice, and community support that make survival possible even in harsh conditions. By evening, your child is notably improved, able to sit up and take more substantial food. The cough remains, but is less frequent and severe. While full recovery will take time, the most dangerous period appears to have passed. You offer silent thanks to God, to the plants that provided medicine, to the neighbors who offered support, and to the knowledge passed down from ancestors that guided your care. As darkness falls once more, your family settles by the fire. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, but tonight there is the quiet satisfaction of having weathered another of winter's threats. Your child dozes, breathing more easily than the night before. Outside, the stars emerge in the clear, cold sky, their light reaching your world after unimaginable journeys across time and space, not unlike the journey of knowledge that has passed through countless generations to help your family survive this medieval winter night. The next few days bring a welcome respite from immediate crisis as your child steadily recovers. Yet winter is far from over, and perhaps the greatest challenge now looms before your household and the entire village: the growing scarcity of food. It's that dreaded time known as the hunger moon, what modern historians call the hunger gap of late winter, when preserved foods dwindle, but spring's fresh growth has yet to appear. You rise before dawn, as always, and move straight to the storage area of your cottage. With careful hands, you assess what remains of your winter food stores. The wooden barrels of grain, mostly rye and barley, perhaps some oats, are growing alarmingly light. The dried vegetables hanging from rafters, onions, garlic, and a few precious turnips and parsnips have diminished significantly. Your carefully preserved meats, if you were fortunate enough to have any, are likely reduced to small portions saved for emergencies or special occasions. The good news is that your family planned carefully after harvest, preserving and storing as much as possible. The bad news is that even the most careful planning cannot fully account for winter's unpredictable length and severity, or for unexpected crises like illness that might deplete resources faster than anticipated. We need to be even more careful now, you tell your family, as you prepare the morning meal. The porridge is thinner today, with smaller portions for everyone except the recovering child, who still needs strength to fight off the lingering effects of illness. Nobody complains about the meager breakfast. This seasonal hunger is a familiar companion in medieval winter. Medieval peasants developed sophisticated strategies for managing this late winter food scarcity. By February and March, you would typically move to a careful rationing system, often reducing to 2 meals per day instead of 3. Foods were stretched with fillers. Straw might be ground and added to flour for bread, for instance, providing bulk if not nutrition. Wild resources became increasingly important as stored foods diminished. The ice has thinned on the pond, your spouse notes. Perhaps fishing will be possible again soon. This prospect brightens the mood slightly. Even a few small fish would add precious protein to your diet and change the monotonous flavor of winter meals. Medieval freshwater fishing was done with simple tools, woven baskets as traps, hand nets, or rudimentary hooks and lines. In some regions, peasants had rights to fish in specific waters, though these rights were often contested by lords who claimed exclusive fishing privileges. After breakfast, bundled against the cold, you joined several other villagers on an expedition to check winter traps set in the woodlands at the edge of the village lands. Trapping small game was an important supplementary food source, though medieval peasants had to be careful about where and what they hunted. Many forests were designated as the lord's hunting grounds, where capturing game, especially deer, boar, or other large animals, was strictly forbidden to peasants and could result in severe punishment. Still, most lords turned a blind eye to peasants trapping rabbits, squirrels, and other small animals during the desperate late winter months, recognizing that this food source helped ensure the survival of the workforce needed for spring planting. Some enlightened lords even explicitly granted these rights as part of the complicated social contract of feudalism. The good news about the trapping expedition is that 2 snares have successfully caught rabbits, providing a welcome source of fresh meat for the village. The bad news is that these 2 animals must be divided among 5 families who participated in setting and checking the traps. Your share will make one small but precious meal. Returning to the village, the group passes through a stand of hazel trees, and someone notices the first catkins appearing, early signs that winter will eventually release its grip. Though weeks away from producing anything edible, these harbingers of spring lift spirits. Medieval peasants were keen observers of such natural indicators, their survival depending on intimate knowledge of seasonal patterns and changes. Look there, an older villager points out. The first snowdrops are pushing through near that fallen log. These early flowering plants were more than just a pretty sight to medieval people. They marked the beginning of the seasonal transition that would eventually bring food abundance again. Some early spring plants were also medicinal or edible, making their appearance genuinely life-sustaining. Back in the village, you encounter the manor's steward, the lord's representative, who oversees the peasants' obligations and manages the estate's resources. His appearance in the village during winter is unusual enough to cause concern. Typically, direct oversight relaxed during these months when field work was minimal. The lord requires additional firewood for the manor house, the steward announces to the gathered villagers. Each household must provide 1 additional bundle by week's end. This demand is met with carefully concealed dismay. Winter obligations to the lord were generally lighter than during growing and harvest seasons, but they could still be imposed, and refusing was not an option for most peasants. The good news is that the lord's demand is relatively modest, 1 bundle of firewood per household, rather than the more burdensome labor or food levies that might be demanded in other seasons. The bad news is that your own firewood supplies are already carefully measured to last until warmer weather, and this additional requirement will mean colder nights for your family. We'll gather it tomorrow, you tell the steward with a respectful nod, keeping any hint of resentment from your voice. The complicated relationship between peasants and their lords was a defining feature of medieval life. While modern people might view the feudal system as simply oppressive, the reality was more nuanced, involving mutual obligations and unwritten understandings that helped both parties survive. Lords provided land, some protection, and certain rights to their peasants. In return, peasants owed labor, a portion of their produce, and various other services and fees. During winter, this relationship often shifted slightly, with many lords recognizing the hardships of the season and reducing demands accordingly. Some even provided emergency food from manor stores during particularly difficult late winters, recognizing that starving peasants couldn't work effectively when spring arrived. However, the quality of this relationship varied enormously depending on the particular lord, the regional customs, and the specific category of peasantry to which a family belonged. Free peasants had more rights and fewer obligations than serfs, who were legally bound to their lord's land and subject to more extensive demands. After the steward departs, the villagers gather briefly to organize tomorrow's wood-gathering expedition. "We'll go together," the village reeve, an elected peasant who helped manage community affairs, decides. "More hands will make quicker work of it, and we can help the household still weakened by illness." This cooperative approach to meeting obligations was typical of medieval village life, where community survival often depended on collective action. As you return to your cottage, you notice dark clouds gathering on the horizon. "Storm coming," you murmur to yourself, recognizing the signs from decades of weather observations. Medieval weather forecasting relied entirely on such traditional knowledge: cloud patterns, animal behaviors, wind shifts, and other natural indicators passed down through generations of rural experience. Inside your home, you find your children engaged in essential winter tasks. Medieval children began contributing to household work from a very young age, with responsibilities increasing as they grew. Even a child of 5 or 6 might be responsible for simple tasks like winding yarn, feeding small animals, or helping process preserved foods. By 8 or 10, children were significant contributors to family labor, though their work was generally adjusted to their size and strength. Your older child is carefully separating dried beans from their pods, a tedious but necessary task that provides both food for upcoming meals and seeds for spring planting. The younger one, still recovering from illness, sits wrapped in a blanket near the fire, working on a simple weaving project. The good news about medieval childhood was the early integration into meaningful work that provided clear purpose and valuable skills. The bad news was the lack of educational opportunities for most peasant children, whose knowledge would come almost exclusively from practical experience rather than formal learning. You join them by the fire, taking up your own winter work, perhaps mending clothing, crafting simple tools, or processing wool or flax for textile production. These indoor activities were the backbone of winter productivity for medieval peasants, allowing useful work to continue even when agricultural labor was impossible. As predicted, the storm arrives by evening, bringing howling winds and a fresh blanket of snow. Your family huddles closer to the fire, listening to the sounds of winter's fury outside. Such storms posed significant dangers in medieval times. Travel became nearly impossible, potentially isolating those caught away from home. Buildings could be damaged by heavy snow or high winds. Animals might be injured or killed if not properly sheltered. The good news is that medieval peasants built their lives around the expectation of such weather, rarely traveling far from home during winter and constructing shelters for humans and animals with local weather patterns in mind. The bad news is that truly exceptional storms could still overwhelm these preparations, leading to casualties among people and livestock. As the wind howls outside, your family turns to another critical aspect of winter survival: storytelling. In an age before books were common or accessible to ordinary people, oral tradition was the primary vehicle for both entertainment and education. Winter evenings provided the perfect opportunity for sharing stories, legends, and practical knowledge across generations. "Tell us about the Great Frost," your younger child requests, referring to a particularly severe winter from decades past that has become part of family lore. As you recount the story, perhaps one your own grandparents experienced and passed down, you're participating in the transmission of survival knowledge disguised as entertainment. the tales of how previous generations endured exceptional hardships contained valuable lessons about techniques, warning signs, and emergency measures that might one day prove life-saving. The good news about this oral tradition was its effectiveness in preserving and transmitting crucial information in memorable forms. The bad news was that written records, which might have allowed for more precise preservation and wider sharing of knowledge, remained inaccessible to most peasants who were typically illiterate. As the evening progresses and the storm continues, your thoughts turn to those who might be in particular danger on such a night. Medieval communities were generally aware of their most vulnerable members, the elderly living alone, the infirm, families who had already depleted their firewood or food supplies. During severe weather, checking on these vulnerable neighbors was considered both a Christian duty and a community necessity. When the storm breaks tomorrow, we should check on old Martin, you say, referring to an elderly widower living at the edge of the village. Your spouse nods in agreement. This mutual aid system was crucial to winter survival, creating a safety net in times when institutional support systems, like modern social services, were non-existent. The storm continues through the night, the wind occasionally rising to an unnerving shriek as it finds its way through the thatching or around the ill-fitting wooden door. Medieval buildings were far from weatherproof by modern standards. Even the most carefully constructed peasant homes allowed drafts, leaks, and infiltration of outdoor temperatures. The good news was that these same characteristics provided ventilation that prevented the worst effects of smoke inhalation from indoor fires. The bad news was the constant battle against cold, damp, and occasional leaks during winter storms. Morning reveals a transformed landscape, with fresh snow smoothing the contours of the village and surrounding fields. The storm has passed, leaving behind both beauty and new challenges. Your first task is digging out from the snowfall, clearing a path to reach animals that need tending, and ensuring that roof drainage isn't blocked in ways that might lead to damaging ice dams or leaks. This snow removal was no small task in medieval times, accomplished with wooden shovels and immense physical effort. Working together, village families would clear essential pathways and help those unable to manage their own snow removal. The good news about fresh snow was that it actually provided some insulation, making very cold days slightly more bearable inside peasant dwellings. The bad news was the additional labor required and the increased difficulty of performing everyday tasks like gathering water or firewood. With pathways cleared, you joined several neighbors in checking the community's most vulnerable members. Old Martin is found safe, but low on firewood, a situation quickly remedied by the visiting group who share from their own supplies. Another household has developed a leak where snow melt has found a weakness in the thatching, and villagers work together to make a temporary repair that will prevent further water damage. This pattern of mutual aid defined medieval community life, particularly during winter emergencies. The good news was the remarkable resilience it created, allowing communities to withstand hardships that would overwhelm isolated households. The bad news was that in cases of widespread disaster, a regional famine or epidemic, for instance, even these communal systems could be overwhelmed when everyone faced the same desperate circumstances simultaneously. By midday, the initial post-storm crisis management is complete, and attention turns to taking advantage of the fresh snow for necessary winter tasks. Children are sent sledding down a nearby hill, not merely for recreation, though they certainly enjoy it, but to pack down a smooth snow path that will make it easier to transport harvested firewood back to the village on simple wooden sleds. Medieval winter work often combined practical necessity with elements of play or social enjoyment. The good news about this integration was that it made essential labor more enjoyable and fostered community bonds. The bad news was that even activities with elements of fun remained primarily work, with leisure as we understand it today being a rare luxury for peasants in any season. Your afternoon is spent in the communal wood-gathering expedition organized to meet the Lord's demand. The fresh snow makes walking to the forest edge more difficult, but will facilitate dragging the collected wood back to the village. Working together, the assembled villagers make relatively quick work of gathering the required bundles, though the labor is still strenuous in the cold conditions. As you work, conversation turns to the upcoming Candlemas celebration on February 2nd, one of several religious festivals that punctuated the winter season. For medieval peasants, these church holidays provided not only spiritual significance, but also welcome breaks from routine and opportunities for community celebration, even amid winter's hardships. The priest says, "We'll have new candles this year," someone mentions, referring to the blessing of candles that gave Candlemas its name. While primarily religious in nature, such festivals also served practical purposes in the medieval calendar. Candlemas traditionally marked the midpoint of winter, when half the winter stores should ideally remain if a household was to make it comfortably to spring. It provided a natural moment to assess supplies and adjust consumption patterns if necessary. The good news about the medieval liturgical calendar was the way it provided psychological milestones throughout the winter, breaking the cold season into manageable segments punctuated by celebrations. The bad news was that these religious observances also imposed additional obligations, including special church tithes that could strain already limited winter resources. With firewood gathering complete, you help distribute the bundles, ensuring that each household has their required contribution ready for the steward's collection. Then your thoughts turn to the evening meal, perhaps the most challenging aspect of late winter for medieval peasants. By this point in the season, meals had become increasingly monotonous and nutritionally limited. The same basic ingredients, stored grains and roots, perhaps preserved meat or fish in small quantities, appeared day after day, prepared in ways that might vary slightly but couldn't disguise the limited options available. Tonight's meal in your cottage might be a thin soup of barley and dried peas, flavored with the last of an onion and a small piece of salt pork if your family was fortunate enough to have preserved meat. A coarse bread made primarily of rye might accompany it. Good news about medieval peasant cooking was the remarkable ingenuity developed for creating nourishing meals from limited ingredients. The bad news was the nutritional deficiencies that often developed by late winter, leading to health problems from scurvy to weakened immunity. As your family eats, conversation turns to plans for the coming days. Despite winter's ongoing challenges, thoughts are increasingly directed towards spring preparations. Seeds saved from the previous year's harvest must be checked and sorted. Tools used for planting and field work need final repairs. Decisions about which fields to plant with which crops must be discussed and coordinated with other village households. This forward-looking planning was essential to medieval agricultural success. The good news was that it provided hope and purpose during the final difficult weeks of winter. The bad news was the anxiety that accompanied such planning, as peasants were acutely aware that decisions made now would significantly impact food availability in the coming year. After the meal, your family settles by the fire for the evening hours. Perhaps you engage in minor craft work, carving wooden utensils, repairing baskets, or working with textiles. Many peasant households supplemented their agricultural livelihood with specialized crafts that could provide additional income or trade goods. This household craft production was especially important during winter when agricultural work was minimal. The good news about these craft skills was their contribution to both household self-sufficiency and economic resilience. The bad news was the limited market for such goods in the medieval, rural Economy, especially during winter when travel to markets was difficult and most households focused on basic survival rather than acquiring new items. As darkness deepens outside, your thoughts turn to the remaining weeks of winter. Though February has arrived, bringing slightly longer days and occasionally milder temperatures, you know from experience that winter's grip will loosen slowly. March can bring surprising storms, even as the first signs of spring appear. The transition between seasons is rarely smooth or predictable, yet there is cautious optimism in your household and throughout the village. The worst of winter is likely behind you. The carefully managed food stores, while dwindling, should last if stretched carefully. The community has weathered another season of cold, darkness, and scarcity through collective effort and shared knowledge. As you bank the fire for the night and prepare for sleep, you reflect on the strange paradox of medieval winter, its simultaneous brutality and beauty, its isolation and communal solidarity, its scarcity and ingenuity. Modern people might view your winter existence with pity, focusing on the material hardships and lack of comforts that define this season in your time. Yet, your experience contains elements less familiar to later ages: the profound interdependence of community, the intimate knowledge of natural cycles, and the deep satisfaction of survival through skill and cooperation rather than technological convenience. The good news about your medieval winter existence is the deep resilience, practical wisdom, and human connection it fosters. The bad news is the physical hardship, constant uncertainty, and narrow margin between survival and disaster that accompanies these less tangible benefits. As your family settles onto the shared sleeping space, huddled together for warmth beneath layers of wool and perhaps animal skins, you listen to the night sounds of your medieval world, the occasional crackle from the banked fire, the distant howl of a wolf from the forest edge, the soft breathing of your children as they drift into sleep. These form the soundtrack of a winter night that connects you to countless generations who have weathered similar seasons before you, and to those who will face their own winters in centuries yet to come. Several days pass, each one bringing its own challenges and small victories in your ongoing battle against winter's hardships. The rhythm of these late winter days has a certain familiarity: wake in darkness, coax the fire to life, perform essential chores, find indoor work during the worst weather, and carefully measure dwindling supplies against the remaining weeks until spring. Today, however, breaks this routine. It's Candlemas, the feast day that marks the presentation of Jesus at the temple and the purification of the Virgin Mary. For your medieval community, it's also an important seasonal milestone, traditionally considered the midpoint of winter and a time for both religious observance and practical assessment of winter survival. You rise earlier than usual, as your family must prepare for church attendance. Even in the depths of winter, religious obligations remained central to medieval life. The village church, with its stone walls and perhaps a few modest stained glass windows, was typically the most substantial building in a peasant community, a physical representation of the central role faith played in daily existence. Time to get ready, you call to your children, who stir reluctantly from the warm sleeping area. Preparing for church involves the best cleaning and grooming possible under winter circumstances. While regular bathing was difficult in cold weather, faces and hands would be washed with melted snow water, hair would be combed, and the cleanest available clothing would be worn. For special feast days, like Candlemas, peasant families made particular effort to appear neat and respectful, despite the practical limitations. The good news about medieval feast days was the sense of dignity and significance they brought to otherwise difficult lives. The bad news was the additional effort required to meet social and religious expectations when resources were already stretched thin. Your family bundles in its warmest clothing for the walk to church. The path has been traveled enough recently that the snow is packed down, making walking easier than it might otherwise be. As you approach the stone building, you see other villagers converging from their homes, all making the same journey. Inside the church, the temperature's only marginally warmer than outside. Medieval churches, with their stone construction and high ceilings, were notorious for their coldness. The good news was that this same construction made them among the most durable buildings in the community, capable of withstanding centuries of harsh weather. The bad news was the physical discomfort of attending services during winter, when the stone seemed to radiate cold and the height of the ceiling allowed what little heat might be generated by assembled bodies to rise well above the congregation. Despite the cold, there's a sense of anticipation for today's service. Candlemas involved the blessing of all candles to be used in the church throughout the coming year, as well as some candles that parishioners might bring for blessing for home use. For medieval people, candles represented a significant expense, as they were made from valuable beeswax or tallow, animal fat. Most peasant households used them sparingly, relying primarily on the hearth fire for light. Having a blessed candle in the home to be lit only in times of special need or significance was considered both spiritually and practically important. The priest, perhaps the only formally educated person in your community, conducts the service in Latin, a language few, if any, of the peasant congregation understand. The good news about medieval religious services was their familiarity. Even without comprehending the words, congregants recognized the rhythms and patterns of worship through years of participation. The bad news was the distance this created between common people and direct engagement with religious texts, leaving interpretation entirely in the hands of church authorities. Following the main service comes the blessing of the candles, the most anticipated moment of Candlemas. The priest sprinkles holy water on the assembled candles while reciting prayers for protection and blessing. For medieval people, these blessed objects carried genuine power, protective, healing, and spiritually significant. The good news about this belief system was the comfort and sense of agency it provided in a world full of dangers beyond human control. The bad news was that these spiritual protections sometimes substituted for more practical precautions or solutions. After the church service comes another important aspect of medieval feast days, the communal gathering. Even in winter's scarcity, special occasions like Candlemas warranted small celebratory meals shared among the community. These might be held in the churchyard if weather permitted, or in the largest available building in the village. "I've brought barley cakes," announces one villager, revealing a cloth-wrapped package of small, dense cakes made with precious honey saved for this occasion. Another has contributed dried apple slices preserved from the fall harvest. Your family's contribution might be a special bread, perhaps shaped into a cross or other religious symbol appropriate for the day. The good news about these feast day gatherings was the shared enjoyment and strengthening of community bonds during the most difficult season. The bad news was that even these special meals remained modest by later standards, and the resources used for celebration might later be missed if winter extended longer than expected. As the communal meal progresses, conversation turns to practical matters. Candlemas traditionally marked the point at which half of winter's stored provisions should remain if a household was to comfortably reach spring. This made it a natural time for assessing supplies and adjusting consumption if necessary. "Our grain is holding well enough," one villager comments, "but the root cellar flooded when the snow melted last week. lost nearly all our remaining turnips to rot. Others share similar accounts, the triumphs and setbacks of winter storage management. This exchange of information wasn't merely conversation. It allowed the community to identify households that might need assistance and those with surplus in particular areas who might be able to help. The good news about this transparent communal assessment was the collective problem solving it facilitated. The bad news was the anxiety it could produce when multiple households reported shortages, suggesting potential community-wide scarcity in the weeks ahead. As the gathering continues, you notice the Lord Steward observing from a distance. His presence at village celebrations was common, partly participatory, partly supervisory. In medieval society, the relationship between peasants and their lords was complex and multifaceted. While lords held significant power over their peasant tenants, successful manners depended on a certain degree of cooperation and mutual interest. Today, the steward approaches with an announcement. The Lord invites 6 village men to join the hunt tomorrow. Recent tracks suggest a wild boar has entered the South Woods. This news causes a stir of excitement. Typically, hunting in the Lord's forests was strictly forbidden to peasants, with harsh penalties for poaching. Special invitations to join hunts were both an honor and a practical opportunity to obtain meat during the lean winter months. The good news about such invitations was the acknowledgement of peasant skill and the chance to supplement dwindling food supplies. The bad news was the reminder of the power differential, that access to these resources remained at the Lord's discretion rather than by peasant right. The village reeve quickly selects the 6 men, choosing those with hunting experience and those from households with the greatest need for additional food. Your spouse is among those selected, bringing both pride and anxiety. Wild boar hunting was notoriously dangerous, even with proper weapons and hunting dogs. The potential reward of meat had to be balanced against the risk of injury far from medical care. As the Candlemas gathering disperses, your family returns home with slightly higher spirits despite the ongoing challenges. The religious observance, community connection, and prospect of fresh meat combine to create a rare sense of optimism in late winter. But practical concerns quickly return as you assess your own household supplies by the light of the newly blessed candle you've brought home. We need to be even more careful with the grain, you tell your children as you examine the remaining supply. Just a little longer until the first spring greens appear. This careful measurement and adjustment was a constant feature of medieval winter life, requiring both practical skill and psychological discipline. The good news was the developed ability to make precise calculations about consumption rates and remaining supplies. The bad news was the constant background stress of potential shortage, especially in these final weeks of winter. The next day dawns clear and cold, good hunting weather. Your spouse prepares to join the Lord's hunting party, dressed in the warmest available clothing and carrying a sturdy spear loaned by a neighbor with better tools. The village men selected for this honor gather near the manor house, where they'll receive instructions and be integrated into the hunting party alongside the Lord's trained huntsmen. For your part, the day will be spent on essential household tasks and preparations for the anticipated meat. If the hunt is successful, proper preservation of this unexpected bounty will be crucial. Medieval meat preservation typically involved salting, smoking, or a combination of both. While modern people might think primarily of refrigeration for food preservation, medieval peasants maintained sophisticated knowledge of multiple preservation techniques appropriate for different foods and circumstances. The good news about these preservation methods was their effectiveness at making perishable foods last for extended periods without modern technology. The bad news was the significant labor involved and the need for supplies like salt, which was relatively expensive and had to be acquired through trade rather than local production in most areas. While preparing these preservation materials, you hear a commotion from the village center. Stepping outside, you see a small group of strangers, travelers on horseback, who have stopped in the village. Winter travelers were relatively uncommon, as road conditions and weather made journeys difficult and dangerous. Their arrival would have been a noteworthy event, bringing news from beyond the isolated winter community. They're the Lord's tax collectors, your neighbor whispers, having gathered this information from someone closer to the conversation, come to assess what's owed at quarter day. This explanation brings understanding, but also concern. Medieval taxation occurred on regular quarter days throughout the year, with specific obligations due at each. The upcoming quarter day at Lady Day, March 25th, would require payment of rents and certain fees to the Lord. The good news about the medieval taxation system was its predictability. Peasants generally knew what would be expected and when. The bad news was the inflexibility of these demands, which came regardless of whether winter hardship had left households with the means to pay. You return to your tasks, but the presence of the tax collectors adds another layer of worry to your thoughts. Your household, like most in the village, has set aside the required payment, perhaps coins if you operated within the cash economy, or specific goods or produce if payment was made in kind. But having these resources allocated to taxes meant they couldn't be used for family needs during these final difficult weeks of winter. By afternoon, word spreads that the hunting party has been successful. The wild boar has been killed, though not without injury, to one of the Lord's hounds. According to medieval hunting tradition, the kill would be systematically divided with specific parts going to different participants according to strict customs. The Lord would claim the most prized portions, his huntsmen others, and the peasants invited to participate would receive lesser but still valuable cuts. Your spouse returns by evening, tired but triumphant, carrying a substantial portion of meat, the reward for participating in the hunt. The good news about this windfall is obvious. Protein and fat that will significantly improve your family's nutrition during these lean weeks. The bad news is the need to process and preserve this meat immediately, adding essential but demanding labor to your already full workload. Well into the night, your household works on this preservation, cutting meat into appropriate portions, rubbing it with precious salt, and hanging pieces to begin the smoking process over the hearth fire. The children help according to their abilities, even the youngest, understanding the importance of properly handling this valuable resource. This should last us several weeks if we're careful, your spouse notes, surveying the results of your labor. The relief in this statement is palpable. The psychological burden of food insecurity was one of winter's heaviest weights for medieval peasants. The good news about this successful hunt is not just the food itself, but the mental comfort of having a buffer against hunger. The bad news is the knowledge that not every household in the village received this benefit, and some will continue facing severe scarcity. The following days bring another challenge typical of late winter, rapid weather changes that create hazardous conditions. A brief warming spell causes snow to melt during daylight hours, creating muddy, slushy conditions. Nighttime freezing then turns these wet areas into treacherous ice. For medieval peasants without modern footwear or ice management techniques, these conditions significantly increase the risk of falls and injuries. The good news about these temperature fluctuations was that they signaled the approaching transition to spring. The bad news was the dangerous interim period they created, and the potential damage to buildings and stored goods from freeze-thaw cycles. Indeed, several village households report problems from these conditions. A collapsed storage area where melting snow created weight beyond what the structure could bear, a serious fall resulting in what appears to be a broken arm for an elderly villager, new leaks in previously sound roofing. The community mobilizes to address these issues, redistributing affected stored goods to intact buildings and providing care for the injured. Medieval medical care for injuries like broken bones was rudimentary, but not entirely ineffective. Local practitioners with experience in setting bones would manipulate the limb back into proper alignment and create a splint from available materials like straight branches and cloth bandages. The good news about these treatments was that many fractures did heal adequately with this care. The bad news was the absence of pain management beyond herbal remedies, alcohol, or simple distraction techniques. As the injured elder receives care in a neighbor's home, you join several other villagers in repairing the damaged storage building. This work provides another example of medieval winter adaptation, the ability to perform necessary construction and repairs even in challenging conditions. Modern building typically halts during winter in cold climates, but medieval peasants couldn't afford such work stoppages when structural integrity was compromised. The good news about medieval construction techniques was their relative simplicity and the use of locally available materials that could be gathered even in winter. The bad news was the physical discomfort of performing this work in cold conditions and the compromises sometimes necessary when ideal materials weren't available in winter. As February progresses, subtle but meaningful signs of the coming seasonal change become more noticeable. Days gradually lengthen, providing more hours of natural light for work and reducing the oppressive darkness that characterized deep winter. Certain birds return or become more active, their calls creating a welcome contrast to winter's relative silence. Occasional days bring hints of warmth that allow brief relief from the constant tension of cold. Medieval peasants were intimately attuned to these indicators, their survival depending on accurate reading of seasonal patterns. The good news about the approaching transition was the psychological boost it provided, offering tangible evidence that winter would indeed end as it always had. The bad news was the knowledge that the hunger gap often intensified during these final weeks before spring growth provided new food sources. Indeed, food management becomes increasingly critical in your household and throughout the village. Meals grow even simpler and portions smaller as preserved supplies dwindle. Your family benefits from the meat obtained through the hunt, but even this valuable resource must be carefully rationed to last. For many households, these final weeks of winter might introduce foods not normally considered desirable: inner tree bark processed to extract limited nutrition, deeply buried roots of certain plants that might be excavated even from frozen ground, animals typically considered unfit for consumption like hedgehogs or squirrels. Medieval peasants maintained knowledge of these emergency food sources as part of their survival strategy. The good news about this traditional knowledge was its effectiveness at preventing complete starvation during the winter's end when conventional foods ran out. The bad news was the limited nutritional value and often unpleasant taste of these emergency foods, along with the effort required to process them into edible form. Even as physical resources dwindle, community bonds intensify during these challenging final weeks of winter. Households with any surplus share with those in greater need, not from abstract charity, but from the practical understanding that community survival depends on maintaining the strength of all its members. Today's giver might be tomorrow's recipient, a reality well understood in the precarious balance of medieval life. One evening, as your family sits by the fire engaged in necessary indoor work, perhaps repairing fishing nets in anticipation of ice melt on nearby waters. You hear the church bell ring at an unexpected hour. This immediately captures attention, as medieval bells served as the primary community communication system, with different ringing patterns indicating specific messages or events. Fire! Someone shouts outside, interpreting the urgent pattern of rings. Your family quickly abandons their tasks and joins the rush toward the identified location, a cottage at the village edge where flames are now visible through the thatched roof. Fire represented one of the most feared disasters in medieval communities, with the potential to spread rapidly among closely built structures of highly flammable materials. The good news about medieval community response to fire was its immediacy and organization. Villagers quickly formed bucket chains from water sources to the blaze, brought tools for creating fire breaks by demolishing adjacent structures if necessary, and worked to save inhabitants and salvageable possessions. The bad news was the limited effectiveness of these measures against well-established fires, and the particular difficulty of fighting fires in winter when water sources might be frozen. In this case, the community's rapid response contains the blaze to a single building. The family who lived there escapes with minor burns and smoke inhalation, though they lose nearly all their possessions. Without hesitation, neighboring households offer shelter, clothing, and shared food. This immediate absorption of the affected family into other homes was a standard feature of medieval crisis response. The good news about this system was the absence of homelessness even after disasters. Community members simply made room for those affected, however crowded this might make their own living situations. The bad news was the increased strain on already limited resources, and the knowledge that multiple such incidents could overwhelm even the most generous community support network. As February gives way to early March, your daily routines increasingly incorporate preparation for spring activities. Seeds saved from previous harvests are checked for viability and counted to ensure sufficient quantities for planned planting. Tools needed for fieldwork are given final repairs and sharpening. Discussions about crop rotation and field allocation become more frequent among village members, as medieval agriculture operated on a carefully planned communal system in many regions. The good news about this anticipatory work was the sense of purpose and forward momentum it created during winter's final difficult weeks. The bad news was the underlying anxiety about whether winter stores would indeed last until these preparations could bear fruit, and whether spring weather would arrive in time to prevent a true subsistence crisis. One morning, your oldest child makes an exciting discovery during a trip to collect water, the first snowdrops pushing through in a sheltered area near the village spring. These early flowering plants were more than just a pleasant sight to medieval eyes. They represented the tangible beginning of winter's end and nature's renewal. Their appearance was often celebrated and pointed out to the entire community as a sign of hope. The good news about these early spring indicators was the genuine relief they brought to winter-weary villagers. The bad news was the still significant gap between first flowers and actual food production, a period that would require continued careful management of dwindling resources. As your family gathers that evening, perhaps sharing a simple meal of thin porridge with the smallest remaining portion of preserved meat, the conversation centers on plans and possibilities. Despite the ongoing hardship, there's a palpable shift in mood as winter's psychological weight begins to lift. Medieval peasants developed remarkable resilience through these annual cycles of scarcity and abundance, hardship and relief. The good news about this seasonal pattern was the deep appreciation it fostered for spring's gifts after winter's deprivation. The bad news was the physical toll taken by months of cold, limited nutrition, and heavy labor, effects that accumulated over years of peasant life and contributed to the relatively short life expectancy of medieval populations. As you bank the fire for the night and your family settles for sleep, the wind outside carries a slightly different quality than the harsh winter gusts of previous months. Perhaps there's a subtle hint of change, a whisper of the transformation that will soon sweep across the landscape, bringing greening fields, returning birds, flowing waters, and renewed possibility. Winter in your medieval world is not yet over. There will still be cold days, potential storms, and the continuing challenge of stretching limited supplies. But its deepest grip has begun to loosen, and the proven cycle of seasons promises relief. Your family has survived another winter through knowledge, preparation, community support, and resilience, qualities that define the medieval peasant experience through its hardships and fleeting moments of unexpected beauty. The final weeks of winter bring both the greatest challenges and the first true signs of relief for your medieval household. March has arrived, and with it comes the most critical transition of the year, the delicate balance between depleted winter stores and the first growth of spring. Historians call this period the hunger gap, and for medieval peasants, it was often the most dangerous time of the annual cycle. You wake before dawn, as always, but the darkness feels different now. There's a subtle shift in the air, a barely perceptible change in the quality of light that seeps through the cracks in your cottage walls. The birdsong outside has grown more varied and insistent as returning species join the few that remain through winter. These small changes would likely go unnoticed by modern people accustomed to artificial environments, but for medieval peasants whose survival depended on reading natural signs, they carry profound significance. Today's first task is a hopeful one, checking the earliest growing spots for any edible spring plants. Certain south-facing sheltered areas warm more quickly than the surrounding landscape, sometimes producing the first edible greens weeks before the general countryside awakens. Your older child accompanies you on this expedition, both of you carrying small knives and cloth bags for gathering. Remember what to look for, you remind them as you approach a promising slope near the village stream. Dandelion leaves are among the first to appear, along with young nettles. Medieval children learned plant identification from an early age, their education focusing on practical knowledge critical for survival rather than abstract academic subjects. The good news about this morning's search is the discovery of several patches of young nettles in a sunny, protected spot. Despite their stinging nature, nettles were highly valued by medieval people as one of the earliest available spring greens, rich in nutrients depleted during winter months. The bad news is the relatively small quantity available this early, enough for one modest meal rather than a substantial supplement to dwindling stores. Still, even this small harvest lifts spirits as you return to the cottage. Medieval peasants understood that these first spring gatherings, however meager, marked the beginning of the seasonal transition from scarcity to abundance. The psychological boost often proved as important as the nutritional one. Back home, you carefully prepare the nettles, using cloth to protect your hands from their sting until cooking neutralizes it. The greens will be added to the morning porridge, providing welcome flavor variety and vital nutrients after months of increasingly monotonous winter fare. The good news about these first spring greens was their exceptional nutritional value, particularly rich in vitamins that prevented deficiency diseases like scurvy. The bad news was the labor required to gather sufficient quantities in early spring when growth was still limited. As your family eats breakfast, you discuss the day's work. The seasonal transition brings its own demanding schedule of tasks, all critical for the coming year's success. Fields must be prepared for planting, tools readied, livestock moved to new locations, and seeds sorted. Additionally, the depleted winter stores require continued careful management to stretch through these final weeks before more substantial spring growth appears. "I'll check the plow today," your spouse announces. "The wooden share may need replacing before we begin field work." The medieval wooden plow was far less efficient than modern equipment, requiring frequent repairs and adjustments. The good news about these simple tools was the relative ease of repairing them with locally available materials. The bad news was the immense physical effort required to use them effectively, particularly in heavy spring soils. Your own day will be divided between continued foraging for early greens and necessary household tasks. The medieval division of labor typically assigned field preparation primarily to men, while women managed household production, garden cultivation, and smaller-scale food gathering. However, these divisions were far more flexible than later stereotypes suggest, with all household members contributing wherever needed during crucial seasonal transitions. By midday, you've collected several varieties of early spring plants, more nettles, wild garlic, and the first dandelion leaves from various microclimate spots around the village lands. Medieval knowledge of where to find the earliest growth was refined across generations of careful observation, creating detailed mental maps of the local landscape that modern GPS technology might envy for their precision. The good news about spring foraging was the gradually increasing availability of fresh, nutritious plants after months of preserved foods. The bad news was that gathering sufficient quantities required considerable time and energy, precisely when other spring preparation tasks also demanded attention. Returning to the village, you notice increased activity throughout the community. Other households are similarly engaged in spring preparation, repairing thatch damaged by winter storms, clearing drainage ditches to handle spring rain and snowmelt, and assessing fields for planting. There's a palpable energy that contrasts with winter's more measured pace, despite the physical depletion many villagers show. After months of limited nutrition, near the village center, you observe the reeve and several elder members in discussion, likely planning the rotation of crops across the common fields for the coming growing season. Medieval agriculture in many regions operated on sophisticated systems of crop rotation and field allocation, determined collectively to ensure sustainable productivity. The good news about these communal agricultural systems was their effectiveness at maintaining soil fertility through careful rotation of crops with different soil impacts. The bad news was the complexity of coordinating these systems across multiple households with different needs and capabilities. As you pass this meeting, you overhear mention of the upcoming Lady Day, March 25th, coinciding with the Feast of the Annunciation in the church calendar. This date held multiple significances in medieval life. Religiously, it celebrated the angel Gabriel's announcement to Mary that she would bear Jesus. Practically, it marked one of the quarter days when rents and taxes were due to lords. Agriculturally, it traditionally signaled the beginning of the planting season in many regions. The good news about these quarter days was their predictability, allowing households to plan financially throughout the year. The bad news was the particular challenge of meeting obligations at Lady Day, which came at the end of winter when resources were most depleted. "The Lord expects full payment despite the harsh winter," someone comments, voice tinged with resignation rather than surprise. Medieval peasants understood the inflexibility of these obligations, which remained due regardless of individual household circumstances or seasonal hardships. Back at your cottage, You find your spouse and children engaged in tool preparation. Wooden handles for hoes and rakes are being smoothed of splinters, metal parts cleaned of rust and sharpened where needed. Even the youngest child participates according to ability, perhaps helping to sort different types of seeds or carrying smaller tools between workers. The good news about this family-based production system was its effectiveness at teaching necessary skills from the earliest ages. The bad news was the economic necessity of child labor, which left little opportunity for education beyond practical knowledge. The afternoon brings another critical spring transition task: assessing and preparing any livestock that survived the winter. Medieval peasants might own a few chickens, perhaps a goat or cow, and if fortunate, an ox or horse for heavy field work. After months of reduced fodder and confined conditions, these animals required careful attention before returning to more active work or breeding cycles. The good news about livestock care in early spring was the gradually increasing availability of natural grazing as plants began growing again, reducing the need for stored fodder. The bad news was the weakened condition of many animals after winter, making them vulnerable to disease and less productive during the crucial early growing season. As daylight begins to fade, noticeably later now than during deep winter, your household gathers for the evening meal. Tonight's food represents the classic late winter, early spring pattern: a thin porridge of remaining stored grain, enhanced with the day's foraged greens, and perhaps the smallest portion of preserved meat or fat saved for these difficult final weeks. The good news about such meals was the increasing variety provided by early spring plants. The bad news was the continued caloric deficit that left many peasants physically depleted just when spring labor demanded peak energy. After eating, the family settles by the fire, but the evening activities differ from midwinter patterns. Instead of the storytelling and small handcrafts that occupied the long dark evenings of January and February, tonight's focus is producing items required for the imminent planting season: sewing seed bags from scrap cloth, fashioning simple tools for creating planting rows, or repairing baskets for transporting seeds to the fields. Remember last spring, when heavy rains delayed planting by nearly 2 weeks? Your spouse reflects. We must be ready to begin immediately when conditions allow. This awareness of weather vulnerability shaped medieval agricultural practice profoundly. The good news about traditional farming knowledge was its accumulation of strategies for working around adverse conditions developed across centuries of observation. The bad news was the continued vulnerability to weather patterns that could still defeat even the most careful planning. As the family works, conversation turns to signs observed throughout the day that help predict the coming season's characteristics: bird behavior, cloud patterns, the timing of certain plants' emergence. Medieval weather forecasting relied entirely on such natural indicators, refined through generations of observation and record-keeping, primarily oral rather than written. The good news about this traditional knowledge was its surprising accuracy within local regions, where indicators had been calibrated across centuries. The bad news was its limitation when facing unprecedented weather patterns or rapid changes. The hawthorn is budding early this year, someone notes. That suggests a mild spring ahead. Whether such predictions proved accurate or not, they provided psychological comfort and a framework for planning during the uncertain transition between seasons. The following morning brings exciting news. The first calf of spring has been born in the village. For a medieval community, livestock births represented crucial renewal of important resources. A new calf meant future milk production, potential field labor as it matured, and continuation of the delicate balance between human needs and available animals. The good news about spring livestock births was the immediate boost to household resources, particularly milk from nursing animals, which provided vital nutrition during the hunger gap. The bad news was the additional care required for newborn animals at an already labor-intensive time. The birth prompts a small celebration within the affected household, and neighbors visit throughout the day to offer congratulations and assess the new animal's health and characteristics. This communal interest reflects both the social nature of medieval village life and the practical reality that each household's success contributed to overall community resilience. While visiting, you learn that preparations have begun for the coming Easter celebration, less than a month away in most years. For medieval Christians, Easter represented the most significant religious festival of the year, with both profound spiritual meaning and practical implications for daily life. The preceding Lenten period involved fasting restrictions that paradoxically aligned with the natural scarcity of late winter, while Easter itself celebrated renewal in both religious and natural contexts. The good news about these spring religious celebrations was their alignment with natural seasonal patterns, creating meaningful frameworks for understanding and marking the transition from scarcity to abundance. The bad news was the additional obligations they imposed, including church attendance, special contributions, and expected participation in communal activities during a physically demanding period. As you return to your own work, perhaps preparing a garden plot near your cottage for early maturing vegetables, you notice increased activity around the manor house that dominates the village landscape. Servants are visible cleaning windows, airing bedding, and performing other tasks associated with spring renewal. This activity likely indicates the Lord's family will soon return from extended residence elsewhere, a common pattern for medieval nobility who often maintained multiple properties and moved between them seasonally. The good news about the Lord's return was the increased employment opportunities it created for some villagers who might find temporary work in service roles at the manor. The bad news was the intensified oversight of peasant obligations and more frequent demands for labor service that typically accompanied the Lord's presence. Indeed, by afternoon, a messenger from the manor arrives in the village with instructions for required labor services in the coming week. Under feudal arrangements, peasants typically owed not only rents in money or kind, but also direct labor on the lord's lands for specified periods. The timing of these labor obligations could significantly impact a household's ability to manage its own agricultural needs during the critical spring planting period. The good news about these labor services was their predictability within the feudal system, allowing households to plan around known obligations. The bad news was their prioritization of the Lord's needs over peasant concerns, sometimes forcing less optimal timing for work on family fields. As these announcements circulate through the village, your attention remains focused on the immediate needs of your household during this transitional period. Today brings another foraging expedition, this time to a different area known for early emerging plants. The warming temperatures have accelerated growth, and you discover substantially more available greens than just days earlier. The good news about this increasing abundance was the vital nutritional boost it provided after months of limited diet. The bad news was the continued inadequacy of foraged foods alone to meet full caloric needs during the demanding spring work period. Returning home with your gathered plants, you find a visitor waiting, a traveling peddler who visits the village several times yearly, bringing goods not produced locally and news from beyond your immediate region. In the relatively isolated world of medieval rural life, such travelers provided crucial connections to broader networks of trade and information. The roads are finally passable, the peddler explains, displaying wares laid out on a simple cloth, needles, small metal tools, perhaps spices or medicinal ingredients that couldn't be locally produced. Though the mud is still treacherous in places, medieval transportation infrastructure was minimal by modern standards, with unpaved roads becoming nearly impassable during winter and early spring due to snow, ice, and especially mud. The good news about the resumption of such travel was the renewed access to essential items and information after winter's isolation. The bad news was the limited purchasing power of most peasant households at this time of year, when resources had been depleted by winter and new production had not yet begun. Still, the peddler's arrival creates excitement in the village. Beyond the goods offered, the traveler brings news, political developments in the wider kingdom, weather patterns observed elsewhere, reports of disease outbreaks or other concerns in neighboring regions. Medieval information networks operated primarily through such person-to-person transmission, making travelers important vectors for knowledge as well as goods. There's word of a new tax being considered, the peddler mentions, lowering his voice, to fund the king's military campaign across the channel. Such news would be received with concern in peasant communities, where additional financial burdens could threaten already precarious subsistence. The good news about medieval political systems was their relatively slow pace of change, allowing communities some time to prepare for new obligations. The bad news was the limited influence ordinary people had over decisions that profoundly affected their daily lives. As evening approaches, your household joins others for a communal work session preparing the shared planting equipment. Medieval villages often maintained certain tools collectively, particularly expensive or specialized items like plows with metal components. These would be used in rotation by different households according to agreed schedules. The good news about the system was the economic efficiency of sharing costly resources across multiple families. The bad news was the potential for conflict over scheduling and maintenance responsibilities, particularly during the time-sensitive planning season. Tonight's gathering combines practical work with social connection, as villagers share observations about spring's progression and continue planning the complex dance of field preparation, planning, and ongoing subsistence that defines this season. The sense of community purpose is palpable, a reminder of how interdependent medieval villages were, particularly during transitional periods. The miller reports the stream flow is increasing, someone mentions. The grinding stones should be operating at full capacity by next week. This detail highlights another aspect of medieval seasonal transitions, the resumption of water-powered processes as frozen streams thawed and spring rains increased flow volumes. The good news about these natural power sources was their renewable nature and zero cost beyond infrastructure maintenance. The bad news was their vulnerability to seasonal fluctuations and weather patterns that could dramatically affect productivity. As darkness falls, now noticeably later than just weeks before, your family returns home for the evening meal and rest. The physical demands of spring preparation leave everyone tired, but there's a different quality to this exhaustion than winter's sometimes desperate conservation of energy. There's purpose and forward momentum in the fatigue, a connection to cycles of renewal